let me take you on a journey. In past videos I've spoke about parks, stating that they are on key locations, key points, and they hold immense power. We've also uncovered that most parks were quarries, collieries or mines. And in the video Mother Earth we explored the possibility of those mines and quarries actually mining giant trees. Knowing that parks hold extreme importance and having already explored national parks and parks in general, it warrants exploring amusement parks and theme parks also, which seem to also be linked to holiday parks and camps. Already knowing about the layout of Disneyland and its cloudy past, built around structures of the old, and amusement parks themselves stemming from recreational grounds and pleasure gardens, fairs. We see the rise of amusement parks at the World Fair, such as Luna Park and the White City, Coney Island, and the rise of trolley parks until amusement parks spread across the world. I look to the UK, to my own theme parks, the big ones such as Alton Towers, built around Alton Manor, where surprisingly we will find the location of huge quarries, whose outlay resemble that again of a giant tree. Moving on to Drayton Manor, Fort Park and Blackpool. But this journey will not stop at amusement parks. It leads us on to lunatic and asylums, hospitals and workhouses. We explore Wales and the huge quarries spread all across the country. We see a link to amusement parks, nodes, trees of the past, ley lines and the Earth's grid all connected, as well as the agenda and the harnessing of energy, amusing us as we go through the struggles of life. Amusing us through various means, theme parks only being one of those means, TV I've spoke about often being one of the main ones. Subdued and amused by these things, we go on through life not questioning, pulling people from one polarity to another. And it seems in these locations which have been heavily mined, amusement parks have been set up. For me, one of the reasons being, after taking such a positive energy from that area, and then infecting it with the negative, you would have to counteract that with the positive energy created in amusement parks. Amusement parks themselves set up all around key quarries, which seems to be nodes of giant trees. And even if you disagree with the giant tree theory, they're still based around nodes. And I've often argued that giant trees or trees themselves are just one node, one possibility of the node expressing itself through natural means. Let's explore. We begin the journey at Alton Towers, Staffordshire, England. And Alton Towers itself is built on an old manor, originally the private estate of the Earls of Shrewsbury, opened to the public in 1860. Now all these grounds that we come across and manors all have relation to nobility, which would relate to the taking of lands and then the rewarding of titles and lands. When we look at the old maps, we can see it was called a deer park in past. Now note that as we proceed to Drayton Manor, we will note that was also a deer park. Also note the caravans or the holiday homes, which we will see all around these types of locations. As already stated, the manor, appearing on the old map, has stood for a very long time, the amusement park being built around the manor itself. We see deep forestry, and then surprisingly as we go up past a place called Ramshorn, we see two quarries. And when we dip down into these quarries and see the elevation, the outline and the structure, it does resemble that of trees. Now you just imagine a huge tree trunk, free in this case there, mined out of the ground. And you can tell from the elevation that it's very similar to a tree. Again, more holiday parks, churches, the things we found in previous videos. Now look at the size of these, and they're directly below Alton Towers. And when we proceed over, we find two more. Huge in size, pools of water. Again, can we imagine almost looks like something out of a sci-fi movie, the mining of a finite resource. And in the same location we find a very similar one. I'd love to visit these locations. Within the video I'm going to be very honest and transparent, as I myself are just investigating on a journey such as yourself. Here we find a much smaller one, but still, look at the shape and the size. So I researched what quarry it was, and it was a Grange Mill quarry, held by Ben Bennett. A steel rolling mill, a limestone quarry. It was founded in 1883. All these dates seem to date back to around the same time. Was acquired in 1935. It goes on to talk about how it mines limestone deposited in the marine conditions around 330 million years ago. We've already asked the question, are what they telling us the truth? And our answer was no. And the time scale is a complete lie. It's near a place called Farley. Now remember the ley from other places, representing a ley line, which would represent it being close to a node, as we've already suggested, giant trees being those nodes. And when we look at the old maps again, we see old lead shafts, old quarries, on the same locations where these huge quarries lie today. Much smaller in size then and expanded on today, drained and raped of its resource. Terminus you will see a lot around Stonehenge. Videos such as Michelle Gibson's could easily argue that these could have been potential star fault locations, and I wouldn't argue against it. Look at the size of these quarries. As I've already stated, it almost looks like a sci-fi movie where they tell you they're mining on the moon, they're not. It's ultimately Earth. Again, a lot of these places seem to have human remains, swords. The places of battles, just like we found in the last video. Cauldron, I find that interesting. Referred to again with witches, the last video being based around elms and witches and witch elms. Next to the quarries we see the outline of something huge. But near all these quarries we find smaller quarries of the past, remains. This place caught my eye, this huge pool of water which was land before, and the symbol in the middle. It's strange, random, placed on its own. Obviously that place took of its resource also. Scrolling up to the quarries you can also see much larger land masses. Where the quarry now lies was a place called the Orient Lodge, and the building seems to be quite large in proportion, no longer there, taken, mined under. The pools of water seem to be signified by smaller dots in the past. Here we find expanded reservoirs. Land before, now water. We move over to Drayton Manor. See if we can see anything similar. Would we be surprised to see huge quarries? Huge mines of the past? Drayton Manor has a similar story to Alton Towers in terms of its manor, its mansion. Said to have been reduced to ruins by 1926, with only the clock tower remaining in the park entrance, like a lot of the things we see due to the wars and their taking down of the old world. What else catches our eye? Lately I've been zooming out and see what catches my eye. We find Sutton Park. Sutton Park we found on the last video, Mother Earth, to be full of reservoirs and quarries. A huge landmass, and if you look at the shape, again it's ring circle. Again near Drayton Manor we find Faisley, a place that resembles the name near Alton Towers. The lay again resembling the lay, power, part of the grid. We see the old manor that is no longer there, resided by the car park. Again, part of a deer park. And we find Bassett. This is funny, in the last movie I mentioned Burton Dassett Hills, and also mentioned Bassett as it has a tree on the front of its cover. Again, just remembering how close we are to Sutton Coalfield, which we already know holds power, was mined, was of significance, was a royal town. And here we find a quarry, not as deep in elevation as Alton Towers, but still dug out. And the shape again resembling the shapes we found earlier, a church very close in proximity. It's actually one quarry and a smaller one, I believe. So let's take a look on the older map. What was it before? A colliery. Hockley Hall Colliery, Dost Hill Colliery, brickworks. I won't go into it, but it's funny the relation of red brick to all of the findings. Red brick seems to be of significance, and notice how all of the buildings were built out of that after a certain time period. We proceed over to Fort Park. Fort Park, just like Alton Towers and Drayton Manor, had a huge estate. I can't find much on the construction date. It just states that it was demolished in the 1930s and has soon become a gravel pit. And looking at the park itself, it's obviously flooded with reservoirs and pools of huge size. Again, we found these pools and reservoirs in the past to have been something else, which they have mined or taken from the land and then filled in. The park itself is situated around lots of gardens, parks and greenery, also situated next to an airport and hospital. Richmond Park with literally 5 or 6 golf courses situated around it. We'll take a look on the map later. A zoo, hospital, many hospitals. The area seems to be swamped by golf courses, which often signify mining. Again, we find campsites and holiday homes. Not far from Watford, and Ford for me is a reference to a fort. So this was a fort. Again, relating to Michelle's work, this could have easily been a star fort. I'd love for it to look at the video and give her opinion on the Starfort situation. And still the Starfort could relate to a place of significance, as in a note. It doesn't have to be a giant tree, but there's a lot suggesting toward the giant trees. St. Anne's Hill seems to be the place of importance here. We can see the elevation and the chapel that was the remains of, now hidden by trees. It seems the area around St. Anne's Hill is the area which has been mined. Let's take a look at the older map. Around we can see small gravel pits. Again, we see these on the other locations, indicating that these gravel pits were extended. Quarries made larger. Here we find a lunatic asylum. Note this for later. Lunatic asylums seem to be present near all these type of locations and seem to hold keys to something much larger. Also in close proximity to workhouses and lunatic asylums having a very close link, then being linked onto hospitals, schools and prisons. In the Fort Park location we seem to find a lot of greenery with small gravel pits in. Not so many quarries and collieries. But from some of the landmass, such as the one here, you can tell that the land has been terraformed. And clump sounds and is spelt very similar to stump. Could a clump be indicating a stump? Again, when you come out of these larger maps, it's the big black buildings that are sticking out to me. The old Windsor Great Park, again a deer park. College, workhouse. Building still standing. And these big bodies of water weren't big bodies of water. As you can see, the clay pits and the different shafts all along where the water is now. Whole areas, whole landmass is flooded. You can see them from so high. They're so significant. Again, pointing to something that was took from there was also significant in size. What else could it be other than a giant tree? We could consider giants themselves. We head over to Blackpool. In Blackpool, we see the same type of things. Zoos, holiday parks, golf courses. Now the interesting thing about Blackpool and other places which I'll show you is the influx of water into land, looking like some sort of mud flood had happened. And if you notice, in all the locations where this has happened, major towns have settled. Later on I'll show you southern England where it's happened at London, Bristol, Liverpool. Northern England, as you approach Scotland, the terrain starts to change immensely. And we find more quarries not far from Blackpool at all, which imitate those that we found at Alton Towers, Drayton Manor. Look at the size of this one. Look at that huge slope. It's all connected to the same thing. And the more we stretch out, we can still see it. As I've said, Northern England, Scotland seems to have been a significant part of something, whether that's a selection of giant trees or some other large giant organism. We find the same type of minds. And these are the influx of water which I was speaking about. Look at this one in from London. The one down into Portsmouth and Southampton. We've got the one over by Cardiff and Bristol. Plenty more down in Devon and Plymouth. Dartmouth National Park looks like something of interest. The other side over to places like Hull, got the same scenario. Then it would lead into central England where I'm located, Birmingham being the heart. The other side would be Liverpool, Blackpool. And then up to Scotland you've got lots. The question has to be asked, if a mud flood did occur, did peoples come onto the islands in this way? The question has to be asked, did these people of past times know about a reset, know about the past history? And for me, in terms of the adults, would be yes. One of the reasons they were locked up in insane asylums, reformeries, and other such facilities to essentially highlight what they know and what they saw and what they say is verging on insanity. It seems these people were locked away, the children the same. However, the children with a lesser memory and some being too young wouldn't have known about the past would be perfect to go through to the new narrative. Ultimately not being able to read and write, they wouldn't have been able to read the materials of the past. Only being able to read and write after the materials of the past had been destroyed, edging on to our new narrative and history we see today. A strong possibility, I believe so. We ultimately have to look at this as non-compliance. Those that were compliant were allowed to enter the new narrative. Those that were non-compliant would have been taken out of the regime. Looking at the old maps of Blackpool, and we see Blackpool had an extensive history in the past. Most of the buildings again going back to the 1800s, and the Blackpool illuminations going back just as far to the early 1900s. Known for being one of the first places of electricity in the illuminations, it attracted people and was an amusement. It's pier and arcade. Blackpool's said to get its name from the discoloured waters. It would definitely be representing something. We pull out and see the golf course that we saw on the Google Earth, and it was a park, a hall, with again clay pits and old shafts located very close. Now this structure's huge. Obviously some of the structures that we were looking at are just babies compared to this one. You can see the elevation from the red lines. And what's so interesting is all the mounds that follow an exact line across. Not straight, but still following a line. They're obviously following something. Some type of energy, some type of light. They're trying to highlight something. And if we're to count the stones or mounds, it would be significant. And look how far it stretches. Again, we see old quarries on the sites of newer quarries, bigger quarries, starting off small until expanding. What were these places, really? Helm Park fell. That location we were looking at looks like a huge stump. Look at the size of it. And is it telling us it fell? The bottom part of it being quarried, mined. Again, we find water, a pool and a quarry. Golf courses. And it doesn't surprise us to see a quarry again. Some people may disagree that golf courses were quarries and mines, but the evidence is significant. Everything I'm showing you is telling you that. Now, this is such an interesting find. I came across the County Lunatic Asylum in Whittingham, which was absolutely huge with its annexes, its own church, cricket grounds, cemetery, and the most interesting of all, its own train station. Giving me Holocaust vibes. Now, this building no longer remains, it was completely took down. Said to have opened in 1873 and closed in 1995 to house pauper lunatics. The building made of red brick from clay dug on site. And these clay pits we see everywhere, and the red brick we see also everywhere. The corridors and the way that these buildings were built were worked on workhouse designs. It had the capacity for 1,100 inmates, including its own church, chapel, recreational hall and grounds, and farm. Its own railway, telephone exchange, post office, reservoirs, gasworks, brewery, orchestra, brass band, ballroom and butcher's shop. For me, imitating its own village. Its own town. Annexes built, extensions. Illuminated by electricity by 1892. And I followed the railway. And the railway is no longer there. But I followed it. And the outline still marks all the farms and all the edges, and everything seems to follow it, but it doesn't exist no more. And it's clearly stated as being Whittingham Asylum Railway, simply just for the asylum. And when we come out, it has two openings. It can proceed up and down, so we'll follow it each way to see where it takes us. And again, the railway is gone, but the outline still seems to be followed. It's easy to follow. And this goes on and on and on. And we land in Preston. At the Royal Infirmary. Built in 1869. Closed 1990. Said to have been constructed in 4 years. A Royal Infirmary is a decorative name for a number of hospitals scattered around Britain that were allowed by the Crown to be attached to the royal marquee. And it's just interesting how some of these are royal and other ones aren't royal. Again, like Sutton Coldfield. What were they doing for the monarchy? What were they doing for the Crown? These lunatic asylums were attached to the peoples of the past, and the orphans were attached to the workhouse, and the workhouse attached to the orphans of the past. These workhouses, infirmaries, lunatic asylums all seem to be working hand in hand, working for the same agenda, cleaning up the past, before being transformed into buildings we use today as schools and hospitals, not questioning what they were used for in the past. and again the construction of these huge buildings, built or inherited. So the one end leads to the Royal Infirmary in Preston, a place for the sick, or a place for the orphans, essentially a place for the unwanted, to be transferred to the lunatic asylum. And the other end leads to Longridge, to a quarry, and stops there. It was quite a large quarry. It was attached to a reservoir and was associated again with brickwork, red bricks. It may be far-fetched to suggest that humans and the red brick are related, or is it again a caravan park built on one of the old quarries? We see a huge reservoir next to the quarry, making us question, did more work happen? And when we zoom out, again look at the size of the asylum. And the only other noticeable building was a college, Stonyhurst College, which was established in 1593, but said to have been dated from the year 1200. This building has immense history, and again we see a park clump in the grounds, now just a wooded area. Makes me wonder. And as you can see from the terrain, it seems like there's a golf course or recreational grounds, which we know potentially to be quarries. Look at the size of the building. It's so extensive. It's huge. Again with huge history. And when we look at Whittingham Hospital, it grew to be the largest mental hospital in Britain and pioneered in the use of EEGs. When we look at the map at it and see the size of the annexes and the buildings, the railway, the cricket ground, bowling greens, village and cemetery, just huge in proportion. Back in the 1800s, established only for paupers, mental paupers, buildings of huge, immense quality built for just paupers, and the rest of the landscape having nothing anywhere near that. We search and we find remnants of other buildings. Lancashire at Ebriat Reformatory, said to have opened in 1904, was one of the largest in Europe and was a hospital for women with mental difficulties or learning disabilities. So they had the workhouses for the women and the orphans in particular, the reformatories for the other women, and the lunatic asylums for the other men and women. It seemed they had 3 avenues to get rid of the peoples of past times or the unwanted peoples. And when we look into Preston, we find a huge workhouse. It's almost like some nasty Oliver Twist story. From Preston, from the workhouses which were brought in via the sea, they were taken to these lunatic asylums, reformatories, workhouses. And then there seems to be an association to the quarries and the pits. What was really going on? We see this place, the site of Battle of Preston, with 2 huge parade grounds that no longer stand. Moor Park. I'm sure Michelle Gibson would have something to say about this. Moor we find literally everywhere across the UK. And finally, I'll take you over to Wales, just simply because of the amount of mountains and quarries there. And as soon as I zoom in, what do I land on? A lunatic asylum, to a similar size of the one that we saw in Whittingham. We see an orphan girls' school, again an infirmary, workhouses close by. The same story, quarries. A huge quarry. That again was not a quarry before. This quarry extended, made large. Was forestry before. Forestry turned into quarries. Quarries that were now forests or parks. Golf courses and other like places. We search the area and we find very similar quarries to what we found before. And this pattern, this circle, this sundial, just out on its own, random. Let's find it on the old map. A potential location. We see quarries, shafts all around the area. Wales, similar to Scotland in terms of its landscape. A huge amount of hills, mountains, vast. We seem to find a lot of fords, waterfalls, stepping stones. It's a very similar story to what we saw in northern England near Scotland. Now, do you remember in northern England when we saw the location, that name had a lot to do with fell? There was such and such fell, such and such fell, such and such fell. For me, referring to the falling of trees, a tree had fell. Now, when we come down to Wales, we see a similar type shape and layout, and we see the name fowl, which English representation is big, representing something big. Could it be a big tree? Looking at the layout again, it would have been huge in proportion, but the whole area seems flooded with light places, such as this place. And I found this zip wire world, and look at the size of the quarry. In the heart of the shape that we see, and zooming out, looks like some kind of monster, some kind of creature, some kind of giant. This area seemingly is heart, if we're looking at it from a giant being perspective. Its head seemingly cut off. We'll take a closer look later. This quarry, huge in proportion, huge in scale. Again, near caravan parks. And look at the elevation of it. On the old map we see a slate quarry, huge, but this map to me gives us a better indication of the shape. Look at it. You can see exactly where the centre was and where the routes or the channels will be going out. All around the area has been quarried. Dino Warwick slate quarry. Look at the size of these when you zoom out. Further bodies of water. A similar story. That's that line. That looks like a neck. A head being chopped off, some creature. Let's take a little look down in the so-called head, but that would represent kind of an eye, wouldn't it? It's just a big body of water now, which again was greenery, lands, which has been quarried. You can see the quarry next to it. So it was something of significance and of a large scale. And when we pull over next to it, we see this, which was a huge mine, a mountain. What are mountains? This huge quarry, this huge mine, that was there on both maps, the newer one and the old one. The landscape seems brown, orange, red, drained of its resource and its energy. Here's another. But it shouldn't be no surprise to us at this stage. Whatever these things were, have been raped and taken, and this is all that is left. Finally, we come to Bardon Hill, back to England. Something I caught on the last bit of research. These 4 quarries next to each other, which to me resemble 4 potential giant trees. And right next to it, a place called Coalsville. And if you remember from Mother Earth, coal was a byproduct of trees. We zoom over to this location which spotted my eye next to Bardon Hill, and it's Cannock Chase. It's funny, this is the location where I first met my girlfriend. This was our first date. And look at the area again, the brown, the red, the orange type of look. Negative energy to decay compared to green. Let's take a look on the older maps of Cannock Chase, a location in which my girlfriend grew up in, not far from a place called Burnt Wood. I wonder why it's called Burnt Wood. Think about the relation to the trees again. We see coal pits, but surrounded by plantations, greenery. It was obviously a place of greenery when it was raped of its resource. Oak, Edge, Park, Woseley, Beggars Hill, Springs, Waterfalls, Valley. Remember what I've told you about the valleys? This was a tree location. Cannock Chase was yet another location of a huge tree which was quarried, taken and changed into a park. Burnt Wood. Next to Cannock Chase Reservoir, and next to Cannock Chase Reservoir would be quarries. Shire Oak, again we find a mine or quarry. The same story repeated over and over again in a tree's name location. Burntwood, another area for having a huge old building. Same story as we found in Preston and other like locations. We find scattered around these old buildings that were built that predate, that history is shrouded. And finally we see this campment. I'll take you to another campment that I found in Wimbledon that I thought was interesting. Caesar's Camp. The Caesar's Camp looks like now it's covered by a golf course. A huge journey, but what have we learned? We've learned that all amusement parks are based around old world buildings and old locations of key nodes, all by huge quarries. And then these quarries link to amusement parks, also orphanages, lunatic asylums and reformatories. We find signs of mud floods, extensive reworking of the ground, which suggests trees, huge trees. Certain locations seem to hold more importance than others, but all still seem to have importance. The first locations which seem to have been taken, quarried, are the locations where we find amusements, huge attractions, and also huge towns, such as London, Liverpool, Bristol, Cardiff, Blackpool, Hull leading to central England such as Manchester, Newcastle, Birmingham, would highlight that in these locations towns were then built. It seems these locations were chosen, but the buildings seem more historical than what we're told. It almost feels like the people of the past were wiped out for a new influx of people to come in, take over their buildings, set a new agenda in history. This is debatable, but the findings suggest this. I hope you enjoyed the journey, people. Until next time.